Tonight's class, Can the Infinite Fit? Making a Home for God in This World, will begin momentarily. Good evening again. It's so good to see you all again. And see you, I mean whether on Facebook or on YouTube, whether now live with us or watching this later. So I'm assuming you're home, as I am, and that you've been home for quite a bit in the last few days, maybe even all the time. You're probably very thankful for your home and for whatever comforts it might offer. And you might also be thinking about others, less fortunate people, whose home might be less comfortable, who might have a difficult time being cramped into a home that's too small or otherwise deficient. Well, then here's my question for tonight. Have you ever thought that way about God? I have this nice home. Does God have a home? Now, I know you're thinking I'm a little bit off, that maybe all this virus stuff is getting to me. Whoever worries about God's home? God is a big boy. He'll take care of himself. But actually, I didn't come up with this. King David was the first one to worry about God's home. We'll read that in the book of Shmuel, where King David describes his feeling. It came to pass when the king dwelt in his house, and God had given him rest from all his enemies. So King David became established. Peace had been achieved. And he's settled in his home. Things are looking good, but King David feels bad. And King David tells Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within the curtains. I dwell in a beautiful home, but God has no home." At that time, the ark of the covenant and the temple, essentially, was just a temporary dwelling made of curtains, still from the time the Jews were in the desert, with some modifications. And King David felt terrible. How can I sit in a comfortable home and God should not have a home? All right, so King David thought so. King David felt that God needs a home. Well, what does it even mean? You can't make a home for God. God doesn't fit in a home. God is infinite. He doesn't fit in a physical structure. And you're in good company again if you think that way, because King Solomon said the same thing. King Solomon, David's son, who's the one who finally built the home for God in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, dedicated the home for God with a prayer, a relatively long prayer. And during this prayer, he expresses this sentiment. And we'll read this together. You see that here, verse 27. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heavens of heaven cannot contain you, much less this temple that I have erected. So King Solomon understood the limitations of building an earthly physical home for God. Said, God is too great even for the heavens. How would God fit in this physical temple that I built on a mountaintop in Jerusalem? Well, how did King Solomon answer that question? Why did he build a home for God if God doesn't fit inside? What was he thinking? So as he goes on to describe, and as the commentaries explain, that the home for God is a place where prayer is answered. And King Solomon asks of God in this prayer that every time someone prays to God in Jerusalem and in the Holy Temple, those prayers should be accepted. Those prayers should rise up before God and bring blessing to humanity. And that is why, till this very day, we pray facing Jerusalem, so that our prayers go up through that holy spot straight up to God, as King Solomon asked. Even today, when many synagogues are closed to help stop this epidemic, when people pray at home, we pray facing east towards Jerusalem, or from wherever you are in the world, the right direction towards Jerusalem, because that's where our prayers go up to God. But in Hasidic teachings, there's an interesting reading of this verse, a rather fascinating reading of this verse, where we say, will God indeed dwell on the earth? Heaven and heavens of heavens cannot contain God. Only this temple that I have erected. Rather than reading it where the prophet says, Af ki habayis hazeh asher bonisi, even this home cannot contain God. We read that as the same word af can be read and translated slightly differently, that only and exclusively this home can be a home for God. So let's try to do this together. Rather than translating as the conventional translation we have here, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heavens cannot contain you, much less this temple that I have erected. We translate that, zeroing in on the actual Hebrew word af, in a Hasidic manner, as God will dwell on the earth, because heaven and the heavens of heavens cannot contain you, only, not much less, but only this temple that I have erected. This temple is unique in some way and can somehow contain the presence of God. Now, of course, the question is going to become, how is that possible? Wasn't the question a good one? Isn't it true that nothing can contain the presence of God and a physical home cannot actually be a home for God? So let's backtrack a little bit. King Solomon says that the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain you. What are heavens and heavens of heavens? What is he referring to? Is this some sort of space travel? What are the heavens of the heavens? So fasten your seatbelts for this one because it's a little bit mystical, but working together, we'll get through this. And by working together, I mean that if you do have questions, please post a comment. I will see it and try to address it. So what does it mean that there are heavens and heavens of heavens? And King Solomon says the heavens and even the heavens of the heavens cannot contain God's presence. Well, Kabbalah explains that there are many worlds. Now, don't get nervous. There's only one world and only one universe, and that's where we inhabit. But in a spiritual sense, there are deeper and greater spiritual dimensions described in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism as worlds, one higher and greater and more spiritual than the next. So King Solomon is actually saying something very profound. He says, not only is this physical world that we live in not a sufficient place for God, but even the heavens, even the spiritual dimensions, and the heavens of heavens, greater and higher and more supernal spiritual worlds, are also not truly the home for God. They don't really express God. Now, our tendency is to see God as spiritual. Our tendency is to say that the spiritual, the holy, the otherworldly, the beyond, that which is greater and more elevated than the physical life we live in, is godly. But thinking about it more deeply, in reality, God is not spiritual, just as God is not physical. God creates the physical material reality that we know, and God creates the spiritual too. God himself is truly infinite. And if it's truly infinite, it cannot be defined. It cannot be put into any box, into any description, into any limitation. Anytime you anytime you define something, you're actually limiting that. Anytime we say that this is this, well, it's this and not that. So this device that you're watching me on is a smartphone. It's a smartphone. It's not a baseball. And this is a book, a special one, but it's a book. It is not a hat or anything else. Anytime I give something a definition, that automatically excludes all other definitions. The same is also true, believe it or not, about the spiritual realities. When we define the idea, a reality, a dimension, a spiritual world as spiritual, well, then it's not physical. That itself is a limitation. That itself is a restriction. That itself means that it's finite, and if it's finite, it's not God himself. If it's finite, it's spiritual, it's holy, we might see it as closer to God, but that's not actually the place of God. That's not where God is truly expressed. Now, I know this idea is a little tricky, so let's try it one more way. I would ask you, we'll see if anybody answers. Does a drop of water, the tiniest drop of water, have any value compared to the ocean? Now, typically people say no. It's totally insignificant. Taking a drop of water out of the ocean does not impact the ocean. The ocean is doing just fine without my drop of water. And that's correct. But if you keep drawing drop after drop and drop after drop for a really long time, you do end up having an impact on the water level. The same is true with the number 1 compared to some astronomical number. We'll start with a million. You can go to a billion or trillion. Everyone's throwing out around those numbers these days. How much is the budget deficit going to grow? Whatever number you choose, is 1 significant in the face of a million or a billion or a trillion? So, of course, it's insignificant. But ultimately, truly, it does have value. You keep adding 1 to another 1 to another 1, you keep getting closer, and that million keeps shrinking. Okay, we all get that. Now, how about number 1 compared to infinity? Obviously, 1 compared to infinity has absolutely no value at all. You take that 1 away, the infinity was not impacted at all. So there's absolutely no value there. And that means, in other words, when we progress from 0 to 1, we have made no progress in getting closer to infinity. We may have broken out of the 0 and got to the number 1, and we may go on, but we have made no progress in getting closer to infinity because that 1 has no value in the face of infinity. Let's try that with a larger sum. How about a million in the face of infinity? Well, again, a million is a large sum, large number, but compared to infinity, it's actually nothing at all. Still no progress. We're still not any closer to infinity when we have the number a million or even a billion. Keep on going on exponentially, you will not get closer to infinity. In fact, you're not any closer than you were with the number 1, nor than where you were with the number 0. And this is what King Solomon says. King Solomon says the heavens and the spiritual realms, spiritual worlds that they represent cannot contain God. They are not the home of God. They are not God's place. They might be millions and billions in value compared to the simple reality in which we live, which has become really not so simple anymore. But in truth, they're no closer to the infinite. They're no closer to infinity, to the true essence of God, than we are. The heavens and heavens and of heavens cannot contain God. Okay, well then it sounds hopeless. How can we ever create a home for God? How can we contain God? The heavens can't do it. The millions and billions don't help. What's my 1 or 2 going to do? What's my little bit going to achieve? But that's where the verse continues, and King Solomon says in the Hasidic reading that the heavens and heavens of heavens are not a home for God. Only this physical home that I built for you in Jerusalem. Only here in this physical world, because there's something very special, something extraordinarily powerful about the actions we do in this physical world. So we're all stuck at home right now. So hopefully that means we're spending more time with our children. And if you have young children, you might say, let's play Legos. Let's do building blocks or anything else. And that would mean you would get down on the floor and play with him or her, play with the child. So what just happened? Do you need the Legos? Do you want the Legos? Obviously, the answer to both of those questions is no. There's no, except for some people who have that hobby, you're not really interested in the Legos. Well, why did you encourage the child to play Legos and join him and get down on the floor and play? Because you want the child, you don't want the Legos. You created an interest. You became interested in the Legos. You chose to want to play with some insignificant children's toy as a medium, as a manner, as a tool in which to connect to the child. God gives us something in this challenged, limited world that we live in and we can't make sense of, especially right now. God gives us something that doesn't exist even in the most spiritual realms, among the angels, among any other great mystical ideas, mystical billionaires, to use our analogy, they don't have any access to it. It's unique in this physical world. God takes some physical idea, some physical phenomena, some physical reality, which he doesn't really need, and says, let's get down on the floor and play together. Let's connect using this insignificant toy, which in front of God really is that way, and let's join together. That's how a physical temple, and only that physical temple, a home we've built for God, suddenly becomes a home for God and a place where God can be. That's the extraordinary power of the mitzvahs we perform. God doesn't need me to put charity in a charity box, in a physical phenomena. God doesn't need me to wrap the tefillin on my physical arm. That's not necessary. But God wants me and you and each one of us, just like a parent wants the child. So he says, let's go play Legos. Let's get together and do this so we can connect to each other. People ask me all the time, why is it important to do this or that specific physical mitzvah? What is it going to matter if I move my hand this way or that way? What will change? I should meditate. I should do something spiritual. I should do something that I can appreciate in my heart and soul. And we should. But that doesn't work. It's insufficient. The spiritual is not closer to God. A million is not closer to infinity. Now, don't get me wrong. It's great to spiritually uplift yourself. It's great to have millions and billions in that analogy, but you don't get closer in that way. You get closer by playing Legos with God, by doing mitzvahs, by keeping kosher as much as we can. Try a little more. By putting tefillin, do it a little more often. Putting a mezuzah on your door, lighting the Shabbat candles, whatever it is. You create that space for God. You create that home for God, a place where God can be, a place where God can connect with me and with you and with each and every one of us. We get down on the floor where God gets down on our floor and plays the Legos with us through these tools. That's how we connect to God. That's how we create a space for God in this world. And that's truly what King Solomon is expressing. How do we get on the topic? Because this week's Torah portion, this week's double Torah portion, discusses just that. The Mishkan, the first temple, the mobile temple that the Jewish people created for God in the desert. And our parsha, or shall I say parshas, is truly perplexing when we talk about this. Because in our parsha, we repeat everything that has been said before. We read 2 and 3 weeks ago all the details of the construction of this home for God, and all the details of the construction of its unique furniture, and all the details of the construction of the preparation and of its unique garments for the priests for the Kohanim, and all about the oil they used for the menorah, and so much more. And here we go ahead and we repeat that. In fact, if you go and make an accounting of the psukim, of the verses in these parshas and the 3 that precede it, and a couple more coming up, which all discuss the development of this Mishkan, of this temporary home for God in the desert, you'll discover about 700 or so, depending what you want to include, verses. 700. That's in a Torah which is uniquely spurring with every word and with every letter. An extra letter can teach us a life-changing law. It happens all the time in the Talmud. From one extra letter in the Torah, there's an implication. All of a sudden, we go on for 700 verses describing endlessly this mobile home for God, not an RV, but a movable home for God in the desert. In fact, if you look back to the very beginning of the Torah, you'll find the story of creation, the creation of the entire universe, A to Z, out of nothing. That story takes 22 verses. 22 verses. Takes about 2.5 minutes to read. The whole story of creation of the universe. All of a sudden, we're building this little place for God, which actually, if you include the courtyard, was 100 cubits by 50 cubits. So those of you who remember, we were talking about cubits on Monday. So that would be about 150 feet by 75 feet. Nothing overly large. Takes us 700 verses to discuss. How so? Why so? What's going on? So I once heard an interesting line that really expresses the power of what we've been discussing, the power of the mitzvahs we do, and the power of what Judaism really is. And that is that for an infinite God to create a finite world, that's no big deal. For God, who's infinite, to create our universe, which for all of its mystery and wonder is ultimately finite, that's no big deal. 22 verses is plenty for that. We could have done it in less. In fact, we're taught that it's all included in the very first verse. Infinite God, let him make a couple universes. One a day, keep spitting them out. That's no big deal. But for finite little people like us, to create a space for God, the infinite, in our finite lives, in our finite world, that is truly a big deal. We have been empowered. God gave us the Legos. God gave us the medium with which to connect to him, the mitzvahs that we do, and the home for God that we create in this world. It's ironic to be talking about the home for God and the space for God as so many synagogues are closing. Temporarily, don't worry. As soon as we put all this behind us, synagogues will reopen, and I'm sure with more attendance than ever before. But actually, this teaches us something important. A synagogue is not the only home for God. The home for God is where you are right now. Every single Jewish home, every single Jewish place has to be a home for God. And that is achieved by the way we live our lives in that home. We live lives where we would be comfortable for God to pop in at any time. We wouldn't want a guest when we have nothing to serve or when we're practicing social distancing. We wouldn't have a guest when we're not ready. And would we want God to pop in right now? Well, if we live that kind of lifestyle we'd be proud of, we will. And actually, God, the Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe, recommended that we make our homes a home for God in a very specific way, by performing mitzvahs in the home and by specifically introducing these objects into your Jewish home. So that means in addition to the mezuzah on the door, we have books of the Torah. This is the Chitas, which includes the Torah itself, the Bible, the 5 books, the Chumash, the Tehillim, the Psalms of King David, and the Tanya, the foundational book of Hasidism. And in general, Jewish books should be in the home, and a charity box, tzedakah. A home should be a place of a mitzvah, a place where we would take a coin and put it in, doing a mitzvah. Those are things we should each, and we all can. And if you're not going out, we can order them online, bring them into our homes, make our homes more of a Jewish place. Sunday will be our next talk. Sunday again at 8 o'clock on this Facebook channel and on this YouTube channel, right here where you are right now. Sunday evening, 8 o'clock, we will discuss the small standing tall. The small standing tall, and I'll give away a little bit of the secret, that has to do with next week's Torah portion and has to do with the power of humility. But before we conclude, I just want to mention, and maybe I'll post about this tomorrow in time for Shabbat, that this Shabbos is a very unique one. When we read the Torah portion, in addition to the regular portion, an added segment called HaChodesh, called the month, which describes the beginning of the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, the month when the Jews left Egypt, and what's so unique about it. And we will discover, and like I say, I'd like to post about it if I get a chance before Shabbat, that this reading is really a reading of miracles and describes the month we're about to enter, and the Shabbos, which really we begin introducing it from, which is this Shabbos beginning tomorrow night, as a Shabbos of miracles and a time of miracles. Our world can use a miracle right now, and I'm sure it's coming. And that should be the miracle of the coming of Mashiach very soon. Have a great evening. See you Sunday.